please! I need help! My son needs help out here!
I don't open my door anymore, not for anyone!
Her voice was firm, his was breaking. Two strangers standing on opposite sides of a frozen door, both carrying wounds the other couldn't see. But on this night, one choice would ripple far beyond survival. A decision made in a storm would lead to a truth powerful enough to rewrite the lives of everyone involved. Welcome to Golden Heart Stories. This is the story of a woman who tried to stay hidden, and the family she never expected to save. The blizzard hammered against the cabin walls like fists demanding entry. Each gust of wind, sending icy drafts through gaps Naomi Wells had meant to seal before winter truly arrived. She sat curled on the worn sofa, a threadbare blanket wrapped around her 30-year-old frame, staring at the fire that barely pushed back the cold, seeping through every corner of her isolated refuge. Outside, the world had vanished into swirling white chaos, the kind of storm that buried roads and erased boundaries between earth and sky. She had chosen this loneliness deliberately, traded the betrayals of the city for the honest cruelty of nature. But tonight the solitude felt less like safety and more like a trap closing around her. The knock came suddenly, violently, shattering the fragile peace she had constructed. 3 heavy blows against the wooden door, urgent and desperate. Naomi's body went rigid, her breath catching in her throat as her heart began hammering against her ribs. No one came out here. No one knew she existed in this forgotten corner of rural Ontario. The knocking came again, louder this time, accompanied by a muffled shout she could not make out through the howling storm. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. She had learned the hard way that strangers brought nothing but pain. That men especially could not be trusted. That opening doors led only to loss and devastation. She pressed herself deeper into the sofa cushions, willing herself invisible, praying whoever stood outside would give up and leave her in peace. But the knocking continued, relentless, punctuated now by a voice calling out words she could not distinguish. Her hands trembled as she pulled the blanket tighter, her entire body a coiled spring of tension and fear. The memories flooded back unbidden. The business partner who had smiled while stealing everything she owned. The lawyers who had promised justice and delivered only emptied bank accounts, the friends who had vanished the moment her money disappeared. She had built these walls, both literal and emotional, to keep that world away. And now someone was trying to break through. Against her better judgment, something pulled her to her feet. Perhaps it was the particular desperation in that voice, or the way the knocking had taken on an almost pleading quality. She moved toward the door like a woman walking to her own execution, each step heavy with dread. Through the frosted glass panel, she could make out a dark shape, tall and imposing, unmistakably male. Her stomach clenched, but then she saw movement lower down, something small clutched against the man's chest. She wiped at the frost with her sleeve, pressing her face close to the cold glass, and her breath stopped entirely. A child. There was a child out there, held in the stranger's arms, small head lolling against the man's shoulder. Even through the distorted glass, Naomi could see the unnatural stillness of that tiny body, the way it did not move or struggle against the wind tearing at them both. Then she heard it, faint but unmistakable. A weak cough that barely carried over the storm's roar. The sound pierced through every wall she had built, every lesson she had learned about protecting herself, every promise she had made to never let anyone close again. Her hand moved to the bolt without conscious thought, her fingers numb and shaking as they fumbled with the lock. The moral weight crashed down on her shoulders, like the snow piling against her door. She could leave them outside, preserve her safety, maintain the isolation that had kept her heart from breaking again. Or she could open this door, let strangers into her sanctuary, risk everything she had rebuilt from the ashes of her ruined life. The child coughed again, weaker this time, and Naomi felt something crack inside her chest, some final barrier between who she had become and who she used to be. Her hand gripped the door handle, cold metal burning against her palm. And she stood frozen in that terrible moment of decision, knowing that whatever choice she made would change everything, that some doors once opened could never be closed again. The wind screamed its warning, the fire crackled its protest, and somewhere deep in her battered heart, A voice she had tried to silence whispered that maybe, just maybe, not every stranger brought destruction. That perhaps mercy could exist without punishment following close behind. The door swung open and Winter rushed inside, with brutal force, bringing two snow-covered figures who stumbled across the threshold like survivors reaching shore. Naomi stepped back instinctively, her body tense even as she had chosen to let them enter. The man was tall, perhaps 32 years old, with dark hair plastered against his forehead and ice-crusted in his stubble. His eyes met hers briefly, desperate gratitude mixed with something unreadable, before returning to the small bundle in his arms. The child, a boy no more than 6, hung limp against his chest, face flushed with fever even as his lips trembled with cold. Naomi pushed the door closed, her hands shaking as she threw the bolt into place. The sudden silence felt almost violent after the storm's constant roar. She turned to face the strangers now occupying her sanctuary, arms wrapped tight as though holding together the fragile control threatening to shatter. The man lowered himself onto her sofa, cradling the boy with practiced tenderness. Snow melted off their clothes in spreading puddles across her wooden floor. "Thank you," the man said, his voice rough from the cold. "I'm Adrian Hale. This is my son, Leo." The names hung between them, an offering of normalcy in circumstances that felt anything but normal. Naomi nodded once, sharp and cautious, but offered no name in return. She watched Adrian brush snow from Leo's pale face, movements gentle despite the tremor in his hands. The boy's breathing came shallow and ragged, each exhale accompanied by a faint wheeze that made her chest tighten with unwanted concern. "What were you doing out there?" she asked, her voice harder than intended. "Nobody drives through weather like this. Not with a child." Adrian's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on his son rather than meeting her gaze. "We were trying to reach Huntsville. Family emergency." The storm came up faster than the forecast predicted. The explanation came too quickly, too smoothly, like words rehearsed rather than lived. Naomi felt suspicion coil in her stomach, cold and heavy. She had heard smooth explanations before, believed them until truth revealed itself like rot beneath paint. She crossed to the kitchen, keeping distance, maintaining the physical space that represented her emotional barrier. From cabinets she pulled blankets and children's fever medication kept from when she imagined different lives. "How long has he been sick?" she asked, setting items on the table without coming closer. "Since this morning. Got worse in the car." Adrian looked up, and she saw exhaustion etched deep around his eyes. "I know this is an imposition. We'll leave as soon as the road's clear." His gratitude felt genuine, but something else lay beneath it, a carefully maintained distance matching her own. He was hiding something. She felt it the way she had learned to feel dishonesty, that particular tension in shoulders, eyes darting toward the door calculating escape routes. When he shifted to remove his coat, something slipped from an inner pocket. Naomi caught a glimpse before he quickly pushed it back, a flash of matte black plastic looking nothing like ordinary cards. It was heavier, more substantial, suggesting wealth and access far beyond what stranded travelers should possess. She said nothing, filing the observation with accumulating inconsistencies around this man and his sick child. Adrian spread blanket over Leo, tucking it carefully around the small body. The boy stirred, murmuring unintelligibly, and his father responded with soft soothing sounds that needed no words. Despite her suspicion, despite instincts screaming these strangers represented danger, Naomi felt something shift inside. The way Adrian touched his son carried authenticity that could not be faked, love so fierce it radiated from every careful gesture. Every worried glance at that feverish face. "There's soup," she heard herself say before stopping the words. "And I can make tea." Adrian looked up, genuine surprise flickering before he smoothed it away. "That would be very kind of you." She turned toward the kitchen, putting her back to them with effort feeling almost physical. This was temporary, she told herself. One night of minimal shelter until the storm passed, until they could leave and restore her isolation. But even reaching for the pot, even trying to rebuild walls around her heart. She felt them crumbling grain by grain, worn down by the sound of a father comforting his frightened, feverish child in the warmth she had finally, reluctantly, agreed to share. The wind howled like something alive and furious. battering the cabin walls with fists of ice and snow that made the old wooden structure creak and groan in protest. Naomi sat on the floor beside the sofa where Leo lay wrapped in layers of blankets, his small chest rising and falling with labored breaths that rattled in his throat. The fever had climbed higher as darkness fell, turning his cheeks an alarming crimson while his forehead burned hot enough to make her withdraw her hand in concern. She had not wanted this responsibility, had not asked to become caretaker to a stranger's sick child. Yet here she was, drawing on skills she had buried years ago when her life took a different path. She dampened a cloth in cool water and pressed it gently against Leo's forehead, watching his eyelids flutter but not open. His small hand twitched beneath the blanket, searching for something, and without thinking she took it in hers, feeling the fragile bones and burning skin. The gesture awakened memories she had tried to lock away, reminders of the nursing career she had abandoned, the patients she had cared for before betrayal and financial ruin forced her into hiding. Her touch remained steady even as her heart clenched with the weight of old wounds reopening. Adrian stood near the window, his silhouette dark against the pale glow of snow beyond the frosted glass. His phone pressed against his ear, and though he kept his voice low, fragments of conversation drifted across the small space. Naomi heard words that made no sense for a man claiming to be stranded, words like contract and board and deadline that belonged to conference rooms rather than emergency family trips. She watched the tension in his shoulders, the way his free hand gripped the window frame as though anchoring himself against forces she could not see. "The extension won't matter if I can't get there by Wednesday," Adrian muttered, his tone carrying an edge of desperation that contradicted his earlier calm. "Tell them I understand the implications." "Yes, all of them." He ended the call with a sharp motion, standing motionless for a long moment before turning back toward the room. His eyes found Leo immediately, checking on his son with that same fierce protectiveness that had cracked Naomi's defenses earlier. But now suspicion layered over her reluctant sympathy, questions multiplying with every inconsistency she observed. Who was this man really? What kind of emergency involved? Corporate deadlines and board meetings? Why did nothing about his story align with the image he tried to project? "He's not getting better," Naomi said quietly, her voice cutting through the wind's howl. "The fever needs to break soon." Adrian crossed to them in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees beside the sofa. His hand replaced hers on Leo's forehead, and she saw genuine fear flicker across his features before he masked it with determination. Whatever else he might be hiding, his love for this child was absolutely real, perhaps the only honest thing about him. "What else can we do?" he asked, and for the first time his voice carried no careful control, just raw worry. "Keep him cool. Keep him hydrated. Wait." The words felt inadequate even as she spoke them. "If the fever doesn't break by morning, we'll need to get him to a hospital somehow, storm or no storm." Adrian nodded, his jaw tight with unspoken fears. He settled onto the floor opposite her, maintaining vigil over his son from the other side. The cabin felt smaller somehow with the 3 of them occupying this charged space, tension mixing with concern mixing with the secrets hanging thick in the air between them. Outside, the blizzard raged with no sign of weakening, trapping them together in this fragile sanctuary where truth and lies tangled like the snow swirling against the windows. "If we make it through tomorrow," Adrian whispered, so softly. She almost missed it beneath the wind's roar, his eyes fixed on Leo's flushed face. "Everything changes." The words sent ice through Naomi's veins that had nothing to do with the storm. She did not ask what he meant, though questions burned on her tongue. Instead she wrung out the cloth again, returned it to Leo's forehead, and wondered what forces she had invited into her home when she opened that door. What consequences this one act of mercy would bring crashing down upon the careful isolation she had built to protect her broken heart from ever being shattered again. Morning brought no relief, only grim reality announced by crackling radio voices reporting road closures throughout the region. The highway to Huntsville remained buried under snowdrifts measured in feet rather than inches, and secondary routes had disappeared entirely beneath relentless accumulation. No plows would venture out until the wind died, and the meteorologist's voice carried apologetic certainty, predicting at least another full day before conditions improved. Naomi stood by the radio, coffee cup forgotten in her hand, watching steam rise and dissipate. They were trapped here together, no escape possible, no help coming. She turned to find Adrian already awake, moving through her cabin with unexpected purpose and quiet determination. He had located her toolbox somehow, that battered red metal case she kept meaning to organize properly, and now he worked at the window frame. Where cold air had been seeping through gaps she had learned to ignore over the long winter months. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, tightening screws, pressing weather stripping into place, testing the seal with fingers that knew exactly what they were doing. She watched from across the room, confusion mixing with grudging appreciation. "You don't have to do that," she said, voice still rough from the sleepless night spent monitoring Leo's fever. Adrian glanced back, something unreadable flickering in his tired eyes. "You opened your door for us. Least I can do is keep the cold outside." He returned to the work, and Naomi found herself studying him with renewed suspicion. The way he handled tools spoke of experience beyond casual repairs, competence that came from training rather than necessity. When he examined the door hinges, she noticed how he assessed the entire structure. First, identifying weaknesses with the eye of someone who understood building systems. This was not the skill set of an unemployed traveler. This was professional expertise deployed with casual ease. "Where did you learn to do all this?" she asked, unable to contain the question. His hands paused for just a fraction before continuing. "My father owned a construction company. I grew up on job sites." The answer came smoothly, but Naomi caught that rehearsed quality again, the same too-quick delivery marking his other explanations. She said nothing, simply watching as he moved to the kitchen where one cabinet door had hung crooked on failing hinges for months. Within minutes he had it repaired, the door closing flush and solid for the first time since she moved here. Then he found the draft beneath the back door, stuffing it with improvised weather stripping. The cabin transformed under his attention, becoming tighter and warmer with each repair. Naomi felt suspicion warring with gratitude, unable to reconcile the helpful stranger fixing her home with the man taking secretive calls about corporate deadlines. Who was Adrian Hale really? What was he running from or toward? The radio continued its litany of closures and warnings. Naomi caught fragments about traffic accidents and stranded motorists. Then another story began, something about a missing executive from a major consulting firm. But Leo called out weakly from the sofa and she turned away before hearing details. Adrian's head snapped toward the radio for just a moment, tension flooding his shoulders, before his son's voice pulled his attention back. Naomi moved to check on Leo, finding his fever finally beginning to break, his eyes clearer than they had been the night before. Relief washed through her, unexpected in its intensity. She had not realized how much she had been carrying this worry, how deeply she had invested in this child's well-being despite every wall she tried to maintain. Adrian appeared beside her, his hand finding his son's forehead, and she saw naked gratitude transform his features when he felt the cooler temperature. "Thank you," he said quietly, and this time the words carried weight beyond politeness, a debt acknowledged even if full truth remained hidden between them. Outside, the blizzard showed no signs of mercy, wind howling its promise to keep them trapped together in this small space. Where secrets pressed against every repaired wall, where every kind gesture deepened the mystery. Where Naomi found herself caring despite every lesson teaching her the dangerous price of letting strangers past her carefully constructed defenses. Leo recovered with the resilience that belonged only to children, his fever breaking completely by the second afternoon to reveal a curious 6-year-old boy with bright eyes and questions about everything he could see. He sat at the small wooden table with paper and crayons Naomi had found in a forgotten drawer, relics from the life she used to imagine for herself. She watched him draw with intense concentration, his small tongue poking out between his lips the way children do when fully absorbed in creation. The sight did something unexpected to her chest, cracking open spaces she thought she had sealed forever against exactly this kind of tenderness. When Leo finished, he held up the paper with shy pride, and Naomi felt her breath catch in her throat. The drawing showed a simple cabin rendered in a child's bold strokes, a door colored bright red standing open, and 2 figures in the doorway. One tall with dark hair, one small being carried, both rendered in careful detail that spoke of how much this moment had mattered to him. But it was the third figure that made her eyes burn with unshed tears, a woman with her hand on the door, welcoming them inside. He had drawn her into his story, made her part of the narrative of being saved. "That's you," Leo said, pointing at the figure with such innocent certainty that Naomi had to turn away for a moment to compose herself. "You opened the door for us when we were cold." The simple words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, acknowledging the choice she had made, the risk she had taken, the mercy she had shown. Despite every instinct screaming to protect herself first, Adrian stood near the kitchen, pretending to focus on preparing sandwiches, but she saw how his shoulders tensed, how his hands stilled their movement. He too understood what his son had captured in crayon and paper, the moment that changed everything. That evening they shared a meal cobbled together from Naomi's sparse supplies, sitting around the small table. Like a family that had existed for years rather than days, Leo told stories with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of childhood, explaining about his school and his friends and his favorite books with animated gestures that made both adults smile despite themselves. Adrian contributed his own stories, carefully edited versions of trips they had taken, places they had seen together. Naomi found herself laughing at Leo's dramatic retelling of an incident involving a lost shoe and a very persistent squirrel. The sound surprising her with its rusty unfamiliarity. She caught Adrian watching her during one of these moments, his expression unguarded for once, showing something that looked almost like wonder mixed with sadness. Their eyes met across the table and held for a heartbeat too long, a recognition passing between them of something fragile being built in this isolated space. Then Leo demanded another story and the moment passed, but the warmth remained, settling into the corners of the cabin like the glow from the fireplace. Later, after Leo had fallen asleep on the sofa, Naomi stood at the window, watching snow fall in gentle curtains now that the storm's fury had finally exhausted itself. Adrian joined her, standing close enough that she could feel his warmth but not close enough to crowd her careful boundaries. They stood in comfortable silence, and she realized with a start that she had stopped calculating escape routes. Stopped monitoring his every movement for signs of threat. Somehow, in just 2 days, this stranger and his child had transformed her sanctuary from a hiding place into something that felt dangerously close to home. That night, sleep came easier than it had in months, her dreams populated. Not with betrayals and losses but with the sound of a child's laughter and the memory of shared meals and the feeling of walls coming down brick by careful brick. But sometime in the deepest hours before dawn, Naomi woke to movement in the cabin. Through half-closed eyes she watched Adrian slip outside, returning minutes later with something retrieved from his car. A garment bag that looked expensive even in the darkness. He moved with the stealth of someone hiding evidence, and her old suspicions stirred awake alongside her, reminding her that some walls existed for good reason. That strangers with secrets rarely brought anything but eventual pain, that she was fooling herself. If she thought these 2 days of forced intimacy meant she truly knew who Adrian Hale was or what he wanted from her small, carefully protected world. Naomi drove into town for supplies, the roads finally passable after 3 days trapped together. The trip took longer than expected, her old truck struggling through patches where snow had drifted and refrozen into treacherous ridges of ice. She picked up bread and milk and fever medication she had depleted caring for Leo. Her mind wandering to whether the boy would like the cookies she impulsively added to her basket. The thought brought a small smile, quickly followed by anxiety about how easily she had let these strangers into her heart. The return journey took nearly 2 hours, winter sun already beginning its early descent. As she pulled up to the cabin, something felt immediately wrong, though she could not name what triggered the alarm bells clanging in her chest. The door was closed, which was normal. No smoke rose from the chimney, which was not. She killed the engine and sat gripping the wheel, dread pooling in her stomach, knowing before she entered what she would find but refusing to believe it until confronted with the empty truth. The cabin was spotless when she pushed through the door, cleaner than she had left it, cleaner than it had been in months. The blankets they had used were folded with military precision and stacked on the sofa. Dishes were washed and put away. Every surface had been wiped down, every cushion straightened, every trace of their presence methodically erased as though Adrian and Leo had never existed at all. Only the oppressive silence and cold ashes testified that she had not imagined the past 3 days. She stood frozen in the center of her empty sanctuary, grocery bags still clutched in numb hands, trying to process the abandonment. They had left without a word, without warning, without even the courtesy of goodbye. The betrayal hit harder than expected, cutting through defenses she thought she had rebuilt. She had known he was hiding something, had known better than to trust, yet she had let herself begin to care anyway. Had allowed hope to take root in soil she knew was poisoned. Then she saw it, a single piece of paper on the kitchen counter, weighted down by a small object. Her hands shook as she picked up the note, Adrian's handwriting neat and controlled. The words were brief, maddeningly insufficient. "Thank you for everything. You saved us. We won't forget." The sentiment rang hollow, corporate in its blandness, the kind of thing you might write to a helpful stranger. Not someone who had opened her door and heart to rescue his dying child. Beside the note lay the black card she had glimpsed falling from his coat that first night, the object that had triggered her suspicions. She picked it up, feeling the unusual weight, the quality speaking of privilege beyond ordinary means. No name appeared on its matte surface, just numbers embossed so subtly they were nearly invisible. On the back, a single phone number had been written in pen, nothing more. Days later, curiosity drove her to the bank in town. The teller examined the card with widening eyes, typed information into her computer. Then called her manager over with an urgency that made other customers turn and stare. The manager handled the card like it might explode, his professional demeanor cracking as he looked from the card to Naomi's worn jacket and back again. He could not tell her the account holder's name, he explained carefully. But this card belonged to a confidential high-status account, the kind reserved for individuals with substantial means and institutional connections. Where had she acquired it? Naomi offered vague explanations about helping stranded travelers, watching. The manager's skepticism wore with the evidence in his hands. She left the bank more confused than before, clutching the card that represented everything she did not understand about Adrian Hale. That same week, she received notification that cut the final thread holding her to stability. The Pineford Senior Center, where she worked part-time doing bookkeeping and care assistance, was closing due to budget cuts. Her supervisor delivered the news with genuine regret, apologizing for the short notice. Promising a reference Naomi knew would be useless in a town with no other opportunities. She nodded through the conversation, accepted the small severance check, and drove home through falling snow that felt like mockery, like the universe. Confirming what she had always known, that opening doors led only to loss, that mercy was rewarded with abandonment, that she had been right. All along to build walls and trust no one and expect nothing but betrayal from a world that took pleasure in grinding hope into frozen dirt. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Adrian and Leo disappeared. Thick and official looking, the kind of correspondence that commanded attention through weight and quality alone. Naomi stared at it on her kitchen table as though it might contain either salvation or final destruction, her coffee growing cold in the cup she had forgotten. The return address was printed in elegant lettering: Harbour Square Tower, Toronto, Ontario. She had never been to Toronto, had no business there. Knew no one in that glittering city of glass and ambition that felt like another world from her isolated cabin. Her hands trembled as she finally opened it, pulling out pages of heavy cardstock that felt expensive against her calloused fingertips. The letterhead bore an emblem she did not recognize, geometric and modern, surrounding words that made her breath catch: the Open Door Project. She scanned the formal language, struggling to make sense of phrases like Community Outreach Initiative and Leadership Development Program. But one sentence leapt out with crystalline clarity. "We are pleased to invite you to interview for the position of Regional Program Director, a role for which you have been personally recommended." Personally recommended. The words echoed as she read and reread the letter, searching for explanation that remained frustratingly absent. Who would recommend her? She had no connections, no network, no professional reputation beyond the small-town job she had just lost. The letter provided details about the program's mission: serving vulnerable populations and creating pathways for those facing barriers, work that resonated with the nursing career she had abandoned. But it offered no clue about who had put her name forward or why anyone would think a broken woman hiding in rural Ontario qualified to lead anything. She pulled out the second document, a glossy brochure showcasing the Open Door Project's work. Photos showed smiling families, seniors receiving care, children in programs, all supported by an organization that seemed to actually deliver on its promises. The scale impressed her despite her confusion: offices across Ontario, partnerships with major institutions, funding suggesting both legitimacy and substantial resources. This was not some struggling nonprofit but a well-established initiative with real power to create change. As she flipped through the brochure, something slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Naomi bent to retrieve it, her heart stopping when she recognized what it was. A photocopy of Leo's drawing, the one showing her opening the cabin door, welcoming them inside from the storm. Someone had carefully reproduced it, preserving every crayon stroke, every detail of that moment captured through a child's eyes. On the back, in handwriting she now recognized as Adrian's, were 3 words that shattered her remaining composure: "You opened doors." She sank into her chair, the pieces finally assembling into a picture she could barely comprehend. Adrian had done this. Adrian, whoever he really was, had somehow arranged this opportunity. Had used his mysterious connections and resources to create a path forward for the woman who had saved his son. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow, emotions warring inside her chest. Gratitude mixed with anger, hope tangled with suspicion, old fear of manipulation battling against desperate need to believe that maybe, just maybe, not every act of apparent kindness concealed ulterior motives. The interview invitation requested her presence in 2 weeks, offering to cover all travel expenses and accommodation. A phone number was provided for confirmation, and she found herself staring at it, wondering if calling would mean accepting whatever Adrian had set in motion. She thought about the empty cabin around her, the depleted savings that would last perhaps 2 more months, the bleak future stretching ahead with no prospects. She thought about Leo's drawing and the 3 days that had cracked her isolation wide open, revealing both the pain of caring and the possibility that maybe she still had something to offer. Her hand reached for the phone before her mind fully decided, fingers dialing with a mixture of terror and fragile hope. Knowing that accepting this invitation meant stepping out of her carefully constructed hiding place and into an unknown future shaped by a man she still did not fully understand, a man who had vanished without explanation. But apparently not without ensuring she would not be abandoned to face her losses alone. Toronto overwhelmed Naomi from the moment she emerged from Union Station into the canyon of towers and rushing crowds. She had taken the early morning bus, watching rural Ontario transform into suburbs and then into dense urban landscape that made her chest tighten. The streetcar ride to Harbour Square Tower felt like traveling through a different country. Glass and steel reflecting winter sunlight in ways that hurt her eyes after months of forest and snow. She clutched her worn purse, feeling shabby among professionals in expensive coats who moved with confidence she had lost years ago. Harbour Square Tower rose 38 stories above the financial district, all gleaming windows and modern architecture screaming wealth and power. Naomi stood on the sidewalk staring up, nearly turning back before forcing herself through revolving doors into a lobby that felt more like a museum. Marble floors reflected her uncertain steps as she approached security, stammering her name to a guard who checked his tablet and directed her to elevators that moved so smoothly. She barely felt the ascent to the 34th floor. The elevator doors opened directly into an office space that took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city below, while the interior combined professional efficiency with warmth through design choices that made the space both impressive and welcoming. A receptionist greeted her with genuine kindness, offering coffee and asking her to wait. Naomi perched on the edge of a leather chair worth more than her truck, hands gripping her purse, wondering what she was doing here. Then she saw him. Adrian emerged from a side office, but not the Adrian she remembered. This man wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that must have cost thousands, his hair professionally styled, his bearing radiating authority. She had only glimpsed in fragments during those 3 days. He moved through the space like someone who owned it, which she realized with dawning shock he probably did. When his eyes found hers, she saw relief and something deeper flash across his features before he approached. "Naomi," he said, her name carrying weight beyond simple greeting. Thank you for coming. She stood on unsteady legs, anger and confusion warring inside her chest. Who are you, really? Adrian glanced at his receptionist, then gestured toward his office. Please, let me explain everything. Inside, surrounded by evidence of success she could barely comprehend, he finally told her the truth. He was Adrian Hale, Chief Executive Officer of Cole & North Partners, one of the largest consulting firms in Canada. The family emergency had been real, his son genuinely sick, but he had been running from more than weather. A hostile board takeover attempt had been brewing, enemies circling to remove him from the company he had built. And he needed time away to protect Leo while figuring out his next move. I hid who I was because I needed someone to help us for the right reasons, he said, voice carrying painful vulnerability. Not because of what I could offer, but because it was the right thing to do. You gave us shelter expecting nothing. You cared for my son without knowing we could pay you back. That integrity is rare, Naomi. It's precious. She listened as he explained the Open Door Project. An initiative he had funded personally after their time together inspired him to create something meaningful beyond corporate profits. He wanted her to lead it, to bring her compassion and understanding of what it meant to struggle and rebuild to communities that needed exactly those qualities. The position was real, the offer genuine, not charity. But recognition of abilities he had witnessed when she cared for Leo with skills and tenderness beyond mere obligation. You saved my son's life, Adrian said quietly, meeting her eyes with intensity that made her breath catch. You gave us sanctuary when we had nowhere else. Let me give you the same gift. A place where you belong. A purpose that matters. A chance to rebuild. Naomi felt tears burning behind her eyes, years of hurt and suspicion warring against desperate hope that maybe this was real. That maybe opening her door that night had not been another mistake, but the first step toward reclaiming the life she thought she had lost forever. That maybe mercy could be rewarded with something other than abandonment. That kindness could circle back as opportunity, that the universe occasionally offered second chances to those brave enough to risk believing in them one more time. The months that followed transformed Naomi in ways she had not imagined possible. Pulling her from isolation into purpose that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. She moved to Toronto, trading her cabin for a modest apartment near the Open Door Project offices. Spending days alongside Adrian as they built programs that actually reached people the system had abandoned. They worked late into evenings, hunched over plans for senior care initiatives and family support networks, discovering they shared not just chemistry, but genuine partnership built on complementary skills and aligned values that made collaboration feel almost effortless despite the complexity of their work. Adrian proved not just a benefactor but a genuine partner. His corporate expertise translating into efficient systems and sustainable funding, while Naomi's frontline experience ensured programs remained grounded in real human needs rather than abstract theories. She watched him negotiate with officials and foundations, his confidence opening doors that would have remained forever closed to her alone. But she also saw him defer to her judgment on implementation, trusting her instincts about what struggling families actually needed versus what wealthy donors assumed they wanted. Their connection deepened through shared purpose, professional respect, gradually intertwining with something neither named but both felt growing stronger with each late-night planning session and successful program launch. Naomi caught herself watching Adrian when he talked with passion about expanding their reach. Noticing how his eyes lit up receiving feedback from families their programs had helped, recognizing in him someone who had also been wounded but chose to respond with creation rather than retreat. He seemed drawn to her quiet strength and refusal to let past betrayals prevent her from believing people could be better if given genuine opportunity. 6 months after she accepted the position, the Open Door Project held its first annual gala at a downtown hotel. Glittering with chandeliers and filled with Toronto's philanthropic elite, Naomi stood near the edge of the ballroom in a simple black dress. Adrian had insisted on buying, feeling like an imposter among women wearing jewelry worth more than her former cabin. A reporter approached with microphone extended, asking pointed questions about her background and qualifications that carried barely concealed skepticism beneath professional politeness. She felt old anxieties rising, the familiar voice insisting she did not belong, that eventually everyone would see through her. Then Adrian was beside her, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture both protective and affirming. "Miss Wells is the heart of this organization," he said to the reporter, voice carrying quiet authority. "Her experience and compassion have shaped every program we've launched. The families we serve trust her because she understands their struggles firsthand. That's not a weakness. That's exactly what makes her irreplaceable." The reporter persisted with another question, but Adrian smoothly redirected, his presence beside Naomi both shield and statement. When the interview ended and they were alone again in the crowded room, he turned to face her fully, taking her hand with deliberateness that made her heart race. "I need you to know something," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. "This isn't gratitude. This isn't repayment. What you've built here, what we've built together, it's real. You belong here. And I need you to believe that as much as I do." Around them the gala continued, wealthy donors networking and glasses clinking in celebration of accomplished work. But in that moment, standing with Adrian's hand warm in hers, Naomi felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. The walls she had built to protect her broken heart had not disappeared. But they had acquired doors, passages through which connection could flow if she was brave enough to allow it. She squeezed his hand once, unable to find words adequate to express the gratitude and fear and tentative hope warring inside her. But seeing in his answering smile that maybe he understood exactly what she could not say, that maybe they were both learning together how to trust again after betrayal. How to build something new from the wreckage of separate pasts. How to believe that mercy could be answered with mercy, that kindness could multiply rather than be consumed by a world that often seemed designed to punish those foolish enough to care. A year after that first desperate knock in the blizzard, Adrian drove them back to Pineford on a crisp winter afternoon when the sky shone crystalline blue and roads lay clear beneath fresh snow sparkling like scattered diamonds. Leo sat in the backseat chattering about the cabin he remembered, asking if there would be hot chocolate. His excitement infectious despite Naomi's nervous uncertainty about returning to the place where her life had fractured and reformed into something she still struggled to believe was real. The cabin looked smaller than she remembered, humbler, yet also impossibly dear in ways that made her throat tighten. Adrian parked and Leo burst out immediately, running through snow toward the door. With 7-year-old energy contrasting sharply with the feverish child she had first seen through frosted glass. She watched him spin in circles, arms spread wide trying to catch snowflakes, and felt her heart swell with affection for this boy, who had become woven into her life completely. "Mom, come on," Leo called, the word stopping her heart mid-beat as it always did, that simple syllable. She never thought she would hear directed at her, that gift Leo had offered spontaneously months ago with the generous certainty of a child who had decided she belonged to him. Adrian came beside her, his hand finding hers with easy familiarity developed over months of partnership that had slowly transformed into something deeper. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, reading emotions across her face with intuition developed through countless hours working alongside her. "I keep thinking I'll wake up," she admitted. "That this will disappear and I'll be alone again." Adrian turned to face her fully, his hand cupping her cheek with tenderness that still undid her. "You're awake. We're real. This is real." Leo ran back, grabbing her other hand and pulling her toward the cabin. They followed him inside, the space even smaller, with 3 people filling it, furniture worn and familiar in ways that transported Naomi back to that night when everything changed. Adrian moved to the fireplace building a fire while Leo explored with fascinated attention, touching the sofa where he had slept. "This is where you saved us," Leo said with dramatic flair. "Right here. You opened the door even though you were scared." The simple truth hit Naomi with unexpected force. She had been terrified that night, every instinct screaming to protect herself, yet she had chosen mercy over fear, kindness over safety. That single choice, that one moment of courage, had led to everything that followed, had transformed her life in ways she could never have anticipated. Adrian stood from the completed fire and moved to his coat. From the pocket he pulled a small box, unmistakable even before he turned to face her with an expression mixing hope and vulnerability. Leo bounced on his toes, clearly in on whatever was about to happen, excitement. barely contained as Adrian crossed to where Naomi stood frozen in the center of the cabin that had witnessed both her deepest isolation and her re-emergence into life. He knelt down, not in the cabin's warmth but pushing open the door to drop to one knee in the snow outside, in the exact spot where he had stood that night. Holding his dying son, where she had first seen them through frosted glass and made the decision that changed everything. The symbolism was not lost on her, tears already streaming. As he opened the box to reveal a ring that caught winter sunlight and threw it back in brilliant fragments. "You opened a door when I needed it most," Adrian said, voice steady despite emotion thickening it. "You gave us shelter and care and mercy we had no right to expect. You changed my life. You changed Leo's life. And I want to spend the rest of my days making sure you never regret opening that door. Making sure you always have a home, making sure you know you are loved completely and permanently. Will you marry me?" Naomi looked from Adrian kneeling in snow to Leo watching with hopeful eyes to the open door of the cabin that had been her hiding place and salvation. And felt the last of her protective walls finally crumble. She had opened a door in a storm one desperate night, and the man before her was offering to walk through every door that followed together, to build a life where mercy was met with mercy. Where courage was rewarded with love, where one moment of choosing kindness over fear could reshape an entire future. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, stronger, certain. "Yes." Sometimes a single act of kindness opens a door we never expected. And leads us to the family we didn't know we were waiting for. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your stories and wisdom mean so much to us. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that second chances are real, feel free to share this video with them. For more stories of hope, courage, and new beginnings, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us. Thank you for watching. This has been Golden Heart Stories.